Hi, this is Macrophage, and this is episode... Oh, wait, it's not a podcast episode. This is an emergency video broadcast. Several of you tagged me in a video on Twitter released by Gavin Ortlund the other day called What Ken Ham Misses About Creation. You know that what gets me out of bed in the morning is when old earthers claim that ancient Christians believed in an old earth or accepted longer days of Genesis 1 and all that stuff. So Ortland makes some claims about that in his video, but by and large, he doesn't say anything that's blatantly false except his main conclusion, which I'll get to. But I'm going to focus this video mainly on what Gavin Ortlund misses about Augustine. Ortlund has written a book on Augustine, and he presumably has read a lot more of Augustine than I have, but he still misses some things about what Augustine believed and why. So we're going to go over that after I talk about his main claim against Ken Ham. Ortland quotes Ken Ham from a Four Views book that Ken Ham contributed to. This is the quote that Ortland puts up on the screen. Quote, "While I do hold to a young earth creation, it is not Ken Ham's interpretation. Millions of Christians today around the world hold this view, as did Jesus, the apostles, and," here's the key phrase, "virtually all Orthodox Christians prior to 1800. Gavin then claims, quote, "This is something that I just want to show is not true." He then goes on to demonstrate that Ken Ham is exactly right about this. He divides his video into two parts. The first part, presumably, is his example of Christians prior to 1800, although he never says that. The second part, at about 15 minutes, halfway through, is about Christians after 1800. And again, he doesn't say that. He says modern Christians. But I'm going to go with my man, Paul Johnson here, who says the birth of the modern world was in 1815 to 1830. So we'll just say after 1800 is what Gavin Ortlund means by modern Christians. And he gives examples like Chuck Spurgeon, B.B. Warfield, and others. But none of that proves Ken Ham's statement wrong, because he said after 1800 there are plenty of them. So that doesn't have any relevance to his main point against Ken Ham. What does Gavin Ortlund talk about prior to 1800? Does Gavin Ortlund give any evidence at all of Christians prior to 1800 who believed in an old earth? No, because there aren't any, or he certainly didn't give any. Now, what I usually say is prior to 1700, and I just say there's nothing prior to 1700. The old earth view started coming around in the mid-1700s with a geologist named James Hutton. Charles Lyell was in that tradition. Okay, so there just weren't any old earth views prior to about the mid-1700s. It didn't exist. So I say prior to 1700, and you can't find any evidence whatsoever of any Christian who believed that in an old earth before that. Now, what Ken Ham says is virtually all Orthodox Christians prior to 1800. So even finding a couple examples would not justify what Ortlund said, which is that this is not true. This is what Gavin Ortlund claimed, is that what Ken Ham said is not true. But he never once gave any evidence that demonstrated what Ken Ham actually said is not true. When Ken Ham says young earth creation, he means, this is maybe difficult to understand, he means people who believe in a young earth. That's it, okay? So are there old earthers before 1800? Gavin gives no evidence about this. Are there old earthers prior to 1700? No evidence at all of this in the video. This is a 27-minute long video. As far as I'm concerned, that's case closed. Your main point is wrong, and you showed no supporting evidence for it. Okay. Now, I'm fully willing to dialogue with Gavin Ortlund. I think he's a nice guy. My only previous experience with him or interest in him at all, which is not meant to be an insult, it's just I haven't watched his stuff, was with the Asbury Student Revival. And there were some people criticizing it, and I thought Ortlund conducted himself admirably with grace and charity towards critics. I would be perfectly willing to have a irenic discussion with him on this. That's the word he used. But it is just, when you say something like that, that's a strong statement. And then you don't support it. You didn't show that Kenham's statement was not true. Now, Gavin Ortlund would probably want to come back and say, well, yes, I did, because I showed that Christians prior to 1800 didn't believe, some of them, didn't believe that the days of Genesis 1 were 24-hour days. That's not the same issue as the age of the earth. Okay? So, we're going to focus in on Augustine. I could respond to a lot more in that video, but we're going to focus in on Augustine to try to keep this under a half hour, okay? Point number one, Augustine was a young earth creationist, and Gavin Ortlund does not show that in the video. So I'm going to show it here. From the City of God, Book 12, Chapter 10. This chapter is called Of the Falseness of the History which Allots Many Thousand Years to the World's Past. Augustine is here arguing against a pagan view that the earth was many thousands of years older than the biblical account, and they base this on some historical documents. This is the money quote. They are deceived too by these highly mendacious documents which profess to give the history of many thousand years, though, reckoning by the sacred writings, we find that not 6,000 years have passed. Augustine was a young earth creationist, and when confronted with an old earth view, in his time, he rejected it and said, the Bible says we're about 6,000 years. Okay? Now, that's because he was using the Septuagint. The Septuagint has inflated numbers. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the video as part of this discussion. But it's clear Augustine was a young earth creationist. Case closed. Augustine did believe in instantaneous creation. Ortland makes a big deal out of this, but this is not consistent with any of the modern old earth views, because Augustine was the old earther, or a young earther. Okay? Instantaneous creation does not change much about Augustine's view of Scripture, nor does it change a whole lot about what Augustine believed actually occurred. Okay? And we're going to get into why Augustine believed this, which Ortland pretty much just glosses completely over. So that's what I wanted to ask him directly. Do you understand why Augustine believed in an instantaneous creation? The argument that Ortland makes is that these Christians who lived a long time ago had different interpretations of Genesis for textual reasons. Okay, so what are the textual reasons he gives? Well, Ortland's big three arguments from Augustine, okay, don't demonstrate an instantaneous creation at all. Rather, they're arguments about taking a metaphorical or figurative interpretation of the first couple chapters of Genesis. Okay, so he says the big three are, for Augustine, a problem of light being created in day one prior to day four when the sun, moon, and stars were created. So supposedly that needs to be the source of light. If you read Revelation, and I'm responding to Augustine here, and to his credit, Ortland says you don't have to agree with Augustine, okay? He's just demonstrating what Augustine believed. But what I'm demonstrating is none of these three reasons that Ortland gives are actual reasons why creation would be instantaneous. Augustine gets that from somewhere else, and I'll show you that in a minute. But the big three that Ortland talks about is the problem of light on day one versus the sources of light on day four. We know from Revelation that in the new heavens and new earth, they will not need light from the sun and moon because light comes from the Lamb in the new heavens and new earth. God can be a source of light, and he will be in the new heavens and new earth. So light existing before the sun is not a problem because God can be the source of light. The second big reason he talks about is the supposed dyschronology in Genesis 2, verses 4 through 6. This is the old argument about whether, because it says, when there was no man to work the ground, and there were no plants of the field and shrubs of the field, and then God creates Adam and then plants the Garden of Eden for Adam to live in. This whole chapter is about the creation of man, planting the garden, giving him a habitat that he can live in, and then he brings the animals to him to name them and stuff like that. Okay? Old earthers often claim that this means that there's a discontinuity between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, because in Genesis 1, plants are created on day 3 and man is created on day 6. In Genesis 2, it seems to say that there aren't any plants total before the creation of man, and so plants would have to be created after or something, which Genesis 2 doesn't say anything about. It's pretty clear from the context that they're talking about cultivated plants, what we would today call cash crops, or crops that are useful for food for humans. It says it right in Genesis 2, because there was no man to work the ground. Well, do all plants need man to work the ground to exist? No. Only cultivated plants need man to work the ground. Only plants that require cultivation need cultivation. I mean, it's basically a tautology. In Genesis 3, it says plants. In Genesis 2, it says shrubs of the field, plants of the field. That's clearly, it's a different thing. It's talking about a specific kind of plants. Okay? And in context, it means cultivated plants. And again, this is also what's going on with the Garden of Eden. The plants were already there on the world. They were wild. They didn't need cultivation. They didn't need a man to cultivate them. But God plants the garden and puts Adam and Eve there to cultivate the garden. Okay? That's what is being talked about in Genesis 2. Again, this is an argument against Augustine. Ortland is not saying he's necessarily correct. But I just thought I'd touch on it. The third reason from Augustine that Ortland gives is Augustine didn't believe that God needed rest. And since it says God rested on the seventh day, that means this is not really what happened. Okay. I mean, this is a horrible argument. Obviously, the reason God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh was as an example to human beings, which is what it says in the Ten Commandments, in the commandment about resting on the Sabbath. It literally says this is as God created in 6 days, and on the seventh he rested, so you shall work 6 days and rest on the seventh. God did this as an example to us. Okay, so Gavin Ortlund does not necessarily agree with all those arguments. He's just saying Augustine had these objections to a literal interpretation of the first couple chapters of Genesis. Okay, fine. Why did Augustine believe in an instantaneous creation? None of those arguments support instantaneous creation. Where was Augustine getting this? Not from Genesis 1 and 2. Okay. The main reason why Augustine believed this is philosophical. He believed that instantaneous creation was the best way for God to demonstrate his omnipotence. And this is similar to Augustine's argument about the day of rest. God doesn't need to rest. He's omnipotent. Okay? This is ancient Greek philosophy coming to the fore of Augustine's thought. Augustine was a Manichaean for 10 years before he became a Christian. He had all this other philosophy floating around in his head. Okay? Just to give you an example of how the ancient Greeks thought about God, Aristotle thought that God was perfect, so far so good, but in order to remain perfect, God could never think about anything that was imperfect. Because if God had thoughts in his head that were imperfect, those thoughts would be part of him. And if they're imperfect and they're part of him, that would mean that he was imperfect. And so Aristotle thought God could only ever think about himself because he's the only thing that's perfect. And he would soil himself and become imperfect if he ever thought about anything besides himself. Okay, this is the way the ancient Greeks thought, okay? This is the way they thought about God when they were monotheistic, like Aristotle. Judge for yourself whether that's consistent with the God of the Bible who sent Jesus Christ to the world to become a man, to die on a cross for our sins. The God of the Bible gets his hands dirty. He does things for our benefit, like resting on the seventh day. Okay, but Augustine thought that an omnipotent God, the best example or proof of God's omnipotence was to create instantaneously. And this was the main reason Augustine believed this. Okay, it was a philosophical reason. Now, Augustine also uses a biblical argument that is really interesting. It's based on a book called Sirach, which is in the Catholic Bible. It's not in the Protestant canon, but it's in the Catholic canon. This is an ancient Hebrew book, which we have no current manuscript in Hebrew. The only manuscript we have of it is the Septuagint version, which is Greek. Okay, so you've already got a translation, but Augustine didn't know Greek, which Ortland mentions, as though it doesn't matter. But in this case, it absolutely does matter, because it turns out Augustine has mistranslated and misunderstood a verse in the book of Sirach, chapter 18, verse 1. Okay? And why did he misunderstand it? Because he used a Latin translation. This verse in the modern Revised Standard Version says, "He who lives forever created the whole universe." Now, the issue is that word whole. Okay? In Greek, that's koine. Now, if you're like me and you only know enough Greek to be dangerous, you've heard the term koine before. It's used as the root word of the word in the New Testament that means a fellowship of believers, koinonia. In fact, you may have been to a Bible study called koinonia, right? It means a fellowship or a communion, okay? The word there is just koine, which you should also recognize because that's the name of the Greek dialect that the New Testament is written in. It's called Koine Greek. What it means there is common, right? As in the common Greek dialect spoken by everyone. Okay? Universal. We might say vernacular today. That's a special English word that we have. We have 4 million words in English, so we can be way more precise than ancient Hebrew or Greek. I don't know how many words are in Greek, but I think ancient Hebrew only has like 8,000 words or something. So when they had to be specific, they strung together words. Excuse me. But anyway, that's off topic. So koine, translated here, should mean, so literally it says, "He who lives forever created the universe in common or all together," meaning that it's the whole universe in fellowship with itself or in communion with itself or consistent with itself, right? That's what it means. And they translate this, I think, appropriately, the whole universe. So that's what it said in the Septuagint. Now, the Latin translation that Augustine had used the word simul, which you should recognize also as the root word of simultaneous. In other words, simul has temporal or time-based connotations, whereas koine does not. And Augustine uses the Latin word simul and says this has temporal connotations. And he translated it, "He who lives forever created the whole, or created the universe simultaneously." This is why Augustine believed in instantaneous creation, at least the biblical argument. It's not in Genesis. It's from another book that's in the Apocrypha. Okay, it's not even in the Protestant canon. And it's a Latin translation of a Greek translation of the original Hebrew, which is lost. But we know that this is an improper interpretation of this verse. So it does matter that Augustine knew Latin and not Greek. Modern scholarship, thank goodness, means I don't have to learn Greek to learn all that. I just go to, creation.com and search this stuff, okay? Another argument that Augustine did use that was from Genesis 2:4, is involving the word yom. Augustine said this is a literal day in Genesis 2:4, and it's there's a phrase used there in Hebrew. It's like in the day of, right? And so he says this version of yom means all at once at the same time or something, or in the same day, and refers to all of creation. But of course, this is not consistent with a day-age view that says yom in Genesis 1 means something else, right? So Augustine was trying to interpret the word yom as meaning at the same time or something. But you can't do that with Genesis 1 because it gives ordinal and cardinal numbers for all the days. This happened on the first day. This happened on the second day. So if they're instants, they're subsequent instants, okay? So Augustine has to interpret the word yom inconsistently to make that argument, okay? Those are the reasons why Augustine believed in an instantaneous creation, and Gavin Ortlund does not mention those at all. Why? Because it's inconsistent with all modern old earth views. Okay? And Augustine was clearly wrong about these. All right, so let's do one more interesting example from what Augustine wrote about the genealogies in particular. Now, the genealogies are the best argument for young earth creation from Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. There is no viable alternative interpretation of those chapters except the young earth chapters, the young earth interpretation. There are crazy attempts at interpretations that sound like numerology and Bible code stuff, as in like, well, you take all these numbers and you subtract 7 and you can divide them by 5 and somehow that means something. Except it doesn't work for that one over there, and these ones you have to add 2. I mean, it's really crazy. There are no alternative interpretations of the genealogies. So I prefer that young earth creationists start at the genealogies and ask someone like Gavin Ortlund or anyone else, what's your interpretation of the genealogies? Let's start there, okay? Instead, we get forced into arguments about Genesis 1, which I think our argument is pretty strong there, but, that kind of goes round and round and has for a long time. But Augustine was actually involved in debates about whether to use the Septuagint text, which is the Greek text we talked about earlier, or the Masoretic text of Genesis, which is a Hebrew version. Okay? And so Augustine looked at the genealogies. Why? Because one of the key differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic is, in fact, some of the numbers in the genealogy in Genesis 5 are different in the two different texts. Now, today we use the Masoretic, I think correctly, and Augustine comes to that conclusion as well. But the interesting point is why? Why did Augustine prefer the Masoretic over the Septuagint? This is really interesting, guys. I got this from an article by Lita Sanders and Robert Carter on creation.com. Okay. Augustine noticed that the way that the numbers were different from the Masoretic is that several of the ages at which the antediluvian patriarchs had sons were 100 years higher than in the Masoretic. Exactly 100 years. Okay, so that's a real pattern, right? But the ones who had sons at an older age, like over 100, didn't get 100 years added to them. In fact, they're the same numbers in both texts. So why does it look like some of the numbers in the Septuagint have 100 years added to them and some of the other ones didn't? Well, Augustine suggested that the 70 Jewish scholars who translated the Septuagint from Hebrew So this text is sometimes called the 70 or the LXX, Roman numerals for 70, after the 70 Jewish scholars. Augustine suggested that these Jewish scholars were a little bit embarrassed by the fact that these numbers in Genesis 5 were like 900 years, and no one lives 900 years back then, even in the 2nd century BC. And so they were a little embarrassed by these numbers. And so Augustine thinks that the Jews argued that the numbers all had to be divided by 10, and then they would be normal and believable numbers. So if you think about it, most of those antediluvian patriarchs lived to be about 900 years, except for Lamech, who was like 777. If you divide all those numbers by 10, you get about 90, and that's a believable number. Okay, great. Let's divide all the numbers in Genesis 5 by 10. Oh, wait, we have a problem. Because some of those guys had their sons that are recorded in the genealogy at ages of like 65 or somewhere around there. So if you divide that by 10, that gives you age 6. They can't be having sons at age 6, okay? So what did they do? They added 100 years to all the numbers that were too low when you divide them by 10. Now you get age 16 when you divide by 10 instead of age 6. That was Augustine's theory. That the Jews, the 70 Jewish scholars, when they translated this, decided to add 100 years to all of the numbers that were too low to be divisible by 10 and get a believable age for fatherhood. Interesting theory from Augustine. But what it shows is that, and Augustine says, this is a reason to reject the Septuagint because the numbers have been altered to make them more believable. Augustine did not accept the argument that we need to divide these by 10 to get believable ages. He clearly believed these ages were correct at 900 some odd years and all the rest. Okay? So he explicitly rejected the Septuagint and favored the Masoretic on the basis of he thought the numbers were accurate, actual ages, and we shouldn't alter them to make them more believable. That's the interesting point that I wanted to make. Okay, so that's Augustine. I hope this has been interesting to you. Gavin Ortlund mentions that he wants to dialogue with Ken Ham. I don't think that's going to happen. Ken Ham, if I were Ken Ham, I probably wouldn't want to dialogue with Gavin Ortlund because throughout this video, I felt that Gavin Ortlund misrepresented what Ken Ham has said. Particularly about the status of Old Earth Christians. If you watch the video where Ken Ham shows up on Allie Beth Stuckey's show, he says pretty clearly what his problem is with the Old Earth view. He says it's inconsistent with other Christian beliefs. It's an inconsistent belief system. He doesn't say that they're not Christians. He doesn't say, as Gavin Ortlund attributes to him, quote, a litmus test for faithful Christians. He doesn't say any of these things. Ortlund says something about throwing the word liberal around. I don't remember Ken Ham saying the word liberal. I remember Ortlund said it twice in reference to what Ken Ham believes. But Ken Ham never said that. He might say that some other place. I don't know. If you're wanting to dialogue with someone, you need to not put words in their mouth and accurately relate to your audience what they are saying. I think Ortland comes pretty close to bearing false witness in this video, honestly. It's very close. He doesn't outright say Ken Ham says this, but he strongly implies things like Ken Ham believes you're not a real believer, or, young earth creationism is a, quote, litmus test for a faithful Christian, and stuff like that. And I get really tired of having to deal with this because I'm willing to criticize Ken Ham. I don't like some of the things he says, but get it right. If you're going to criticize him for what he actually said and not make up a bunch of stuff because you're offended by what he said and act like he's being a whole lot meaner than he actually is. Okay? Gavin, if you want to dialogue with some young Earth creationists, I'm available, but I realize that my platform is not big enough for you. Okay, so, but if you're really interested in constructive dialogue, there are some young Earth creationists who do dialogues like this in a constructive manner with old Earth Christians. I would recommend someone like Marcus Ross, who recently debated Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, or someone like Jason Lyle, who has debated Hugh Ross. There's plenty of other young Earth creationists in the sea besides Ken Ham. Now, Ken Ham is the most famous one, but he's probably not the one who's going to be the best one to dialogue with old Earthers. So I would recommend, I can do it. I could dialogue with you if that's what you really want. Marcus Ross, Jason Lyle, there are a lot of others. DM me. I can send you a list of 15 off the top of my head who would be better than Ken Ham. If that's what you really want. Gavin claims that he's not in it for the clicks, but he's going after Ken Ham. That's all I'm going to say. All right. But the bottom line is the central claim that Gavin makes is not true and is not supported by the information that he gave in the video. There are no old Earth Christians prior to 1700. And what Ken Ham says is also true, that there are virtually all Orthodox Christians prior to 1800 were not old Earth creationists. They did not believe in an old Earth. They held to a young Earth. Yes, they disagreed with Ken Ham on some other things, but that's not what Ken Ham said. Okay? Your central claim is false. What Ken Ham said is accurate, and you gave no information otherwise. Case closed.